Hi, everyone, here at York University and with us online. And welcome to the latest installment of the African Extractivism and Green Transition Project's Critical Mineral Seminar. This week, we're looking at critical minerals and developmentalism in Southern Africa, problems of developmental regionalism. I'm Richard Saunders. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics here at York University in Toronto. And a warm welcome to our guests online from Africa and other parts of Canada and further afield, and to our guests here in the room at York. This is the third of our critical mineral seminars of this term, and it's the last of the year at 6 this year. We will be resuming in January of 2026, so please tune into our website, www.aegt.ca, for announcements of upcoming seminars, podcasts, newsletters, and other materials that we put out from our research. Before we get started, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement for those of us here and for those online. We recall and remember and reflect on where we are. Let's acknowledge the location of York University on the traditional lands of many Indigenous First Nations, which have long-standing relationships with the territories around us here at York, which far precede the establishment of York University. York specifically acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of some specific several Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has long been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Cree First Nation, and note that this territory is subject to the Dishwith One Spoon One Fell Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Welcome everyone, and welcome to today's featured presenter, especially Michael Smith. Welcome back to York for Michael. He's a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology here at York, but he's also a lecturer at University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa, from where he speaks to us today. Mike is. Sorry.
Do you want to sit here? Lisa's saying it's hard to hear. Maybe it might be an issue of being closer to the yard. Or just one person.
Is it difficult to speak? I can speak up a bit if it's hard to hear, rather than shift right now. And I'd like to say that Mike's research, his PhD research, part of which you'll speak to today, is really fresh and innovative. It's been a real pleasure and eye-opening experience to work with him on South African critical minerals policy making reforms debates, and its engagement, its problematic engagement, as we'll hear today, with the rest of the region and specifically with Zambia. I'd also like to underline that this work is funded not just by Mike's work at Mike's position at the Department of Sociology, but also his fellowship as a NGAP scholar, a very prestigious scholarship in South Africa aimed at the next generation of new university researchers and lecturers in South Africa. It's a very small group, highly competitive competition, and Mike is one of the NGAP scholars, and so we're really lucky to have him working with us at York amidst his duties at UCT. He's published a significant amount for an early career researcher in his latest article from 2025 in Extractive Industries and Society is Mining Global Decarbonization for Development in Africa, ? Regional Politics and the Question of South Africa and Africa, which will appear in today's presentation, sure. So a warm welcome, Mike. It's great to have you with us. Before we get started, I'll also introduce and one go our discussants for today. We have two discussants. First, Charles Mwanza who's a PhD student at the University of Lusaka, based in Lusaka. He's a research fellow at the Southern African Institute for Policy and Research, which is an affiliate partner of AEGT. Charles is there. I'm welcoming Charles, and I'm looking forward to your comments. And last but not least, we have Alex Caramento, a PhD student in the Department of Politics here at York, whose work is on Zambia and mining, local content, and related issues, and who is the project manager for the AUGT. So welcome, Alex, welcome, Charles, and thanks for joining us, Mike. The format will be, Mike will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, followed by 10 minutes or so each from Charles and Alex, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor. So no further ado, I'd like to open the floor to you, give the floor to you, Mike, and well, for you, what you have to tell us.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And yeah, it's good to be in connection with York again, even if it's virtual. So it's also nice to see some familiar names on the online participation today, people that I encountered at York and during my fieldwork over the last year or so. Okay, so let me share my slides. And you can just let me know if you can see that all clearly. Alex? Okay, that's a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So let me go ahead. So as Richard said, I'm a PhD candidate. So I'm currently writing up the dissertation. And today I'm going to be sharing with you one dimension of the thesis. And yeah, I look forward to the type of conversations that some of my arguments might provoke. The title of my piece is Critical Minerals and Developmentalism in Southern Africa, South Africa, Zambia, and the Problems of Developmental Regionalism. Okay, so let me get right into it. So, okay, so starting off on a topic which is now familiar to us all, this period of systemic transition, the change in the global order, the movement away from a neoliberal order to a fluid and contested multipolar configuration, which is marked by, among other things, China's ascendancy, renewed industrial policy activism in the center, increased strategic assertiveness of the so-called middle powers, the Gulf economies, the BRICS countries like South Africa, which we'll discuss more in this presentation shortly. And then the intensified interstate and capitalist competition over control over leading technologies and supply chains that underpin the next industrial era. So this all constitutes a new and uncertain environment in which peripheral countries navigate their development trajectories. Now, the transition away from the old neoliberal order raises questions about the scope for developmentalist projects in the global south. And I define this here as state-led strategies to promote structural transformation and achieve catch-up. And this is particularly relevant for countries in Southern Africa who were integrated yet marginalized in the previous order. The emerging multipolar environment may be creating opportunities or openings for development to these projects, but it is crucial to study how these openings are being shaped by this increasingly conflictual global environment, which I've just sketched out, and domestic historical path dependencies that have been inherited from the neoliberal era. Now, this takes us to the so-called critical minerals. So I think we all know the basic contours of the slide, but maybe the one thing to meditate on, because it will structure some of my arguments later, is the idea that criticality itself is not obviously a universal and technicist designation, and divergent and contradictory state and class interests are being brought to bear on what counts as critical And this reflects the fractured and competitive nature of the present conjuncture at both the global and domestic level, for reasons that I hope my case studies later on make more clear. Okay, so this fourth meaning of criticality is sharply exposed when we explore the dynamics of the green transition. So the key tensions here, of course, include China's overwhelming dominance in green technologies based on its current command over central green mineral supply chains, the conflicts between fossil fuel interests, emerging renewable sectors, labor unions, and communities, and then advanced countries demanding rapid green transitions while kicking away the green ladder through various forms of green protectionism, and southern countries, particularly those with carbon-intensive energy mixes, are grappling with how to balance developmental imperatives alongside climate transition imperatives. So the point here is that the green transition is not a predictable linear process, but a dynamic and contradictory field of social struggle with no natural equilibrium. So the challenge for mineral supply economies in Southern Africa: can their endowments of these green minerals support renewed developmentalist projects? Now, this dilemma arises in a region where resource nationalism has resurged over the past 2 decades, as many on the call and have studied in recent years. And continental institutions like the AU and UNECA, they're really trying to mobilize this resurgence and revive earlier developmentalist ambitions, especially those articulated in the African mining vision. And this provides the context for understanding the development of the AU's Africa's Green Minerals Strategy, which was published towards the end of last year and formally adopted at the beginning of this year. And this aims to ensure that African countries do not repeat the pattern of neoliberal integration, which I mentioned earlier, and leverage their green mineral endowment for industrial upgrading. Now, the idea which really is at the center of the presentation today, an idea that's become a little prominent in recent critical political economy literature and explicitly anchors the AGMS, is that African countries should pursue a regional green industrialization program, or what is called a green mineral or climate resilient developmental regionalism agenda. So at this core, this program is about pooling both economic, infrastructural, and political institutional capabilities to advance upgrading along green mineral value chains. Now, it's proposed that this is necessary to achieve requisite economies of scale, needing to involve in coordinated industrial policies, build shared infrastructure, and pool the capabilities that I mentioned earlier, and then to strengthen the collective bargaining power of Southern African states, given the intense geostrategic and commercial conflicts over access and command over Africa's green mineral value chains. So in this view, regional cooperation, rather than narrowly nationalist development approaches, is the most viable pathway through which Southern African states might shift from being raw mineral exporters to becoming producers of intermediates and advanced green technologies. Now, I take this regional development project and its arguments seriously, but I suggest that it needs to be subject to a deeper critical scrutiny, which I argue is not apparent in available literature at the moment. It's important to understand the genealogy of this concept. So although contemporary policy debates often frame this or locate this in technicist language of the regional value chain and global value chain analysis, which I'm sure you're all aware of, the underlying logic of this idea has a far older, richer, and explicitly political origin. So its intellectual foundations, I argue, lie in left Pan-African developmentalism and African adaptations of structuralist and dependency thought, and have deeper resonances with more recent iterations of South-South cooperative strategies. Now, this agenda became prominent in the 1970s and 80s in the region as a response to the failures of what Alex has called the first wave of resource nationalism. It was seen in the founding declaration of SADC, SADC with two C's, and it was articulated in the Lusaka Declaration of 1980, which institutionalized this as its development strategy. Now, importantly, again, this regional program was conceived as a dual political response to global geopolitical interests and power of international mining capital, whose effective command over African mineral resources persisted despite nationalization, and also to South African sub-imperialism, whose apartheid states in the context of the 70s and 80s and capitalist cost dominated regional economies and were hostile to broader projects of political and economic decolonization. Now, contemporary advocates of green developmentalism assign an explicit special role or leadership role for the South African state to coordinate this regional green industrialization agenda. And the expectation rests on the assumption that effective regional industrialization strategies require a type of regional anchor, a developmental hegemon, if you were, with the political will and economic depth to anchor the developmentalist project. Now, the democratic transition in South Africa generated hopes that the ANC-led regime would embody this role for the region. But democratization unfolded in the context of broader neoliberalization and an open regional agenda involving trade liberalization and financial liberalization came to embody the actual policies of SADC, which was formed in the 1990s, and this is SADC with a single C. And for some in the critical political economy, this simply meant that the South African state, who were seemingly reaping the benefits of a regional inequality that the apartheid state had previously enjoyed. The argument goes that the South African democratic state simply stepped into the role of a sub-imperial power. But with the new conditions, this new transition away from neoliberalism, we can pose the question, are conditions now ripe for a revival of this regional developmental agenda? Can it be advanced in the terms proposed by the proponents of this green minerals regional development strategy? So this brings me to my comparative cases. So to do this, I compare the new challenges and dilemmas confronting two pivotal states whose position in the regional political economy are structurally distinct yet deeply interconnected. And this is South Africa and Zambia. Both sit at the center of contemporary debates of how to renew programs of mineral-led industrialization in the current conjuncture. Both economies, as I will show, have been deeply shaped by contemporary global restructurings, yet their specific mineral endowments, their industrial structures, energy systems, position them differently in global accumulation networks and in geostrategic calculation. And this divergence allows us to glean how the same global processes that are reconfiguring the terrain of developmentalism, in particular mineral supply economies, affect the prospects of the regional agenda. Sorry, that bullet point needed to be filled out. And so this calls forth my comparative questions. How are the contemporary transformations in the global political economy reconfiguring the terrain of developmentalism in Zambia and South Africa? And do these reconfigurations create the political conditions conducive to a green developmental regionalism agenda, as seen, for example, as I said, in the AGMS? Now, the theoretical framework that I'm deploying here, I must say that I'm drawing rather liberally on insights from two distinct theoretical traditions. The first is the political settlements approach, pioneered by Mushtaq Khan. This treats the state as a differentiated social relation, shaped by the structural power of capital, but mediated in specific domains by organized interests and political capabilities, which I think that my case studies are going to reveal. And what really draws me to this approach is its open-ended and emphasis on open-ended and conjunctural analysis. And this allows for the type of historical analysis that I'm attempting to enact in my dissertation. I'm combining this with the class relational global production network and global commodity chain approach. And then the real effort here is to try to I tried to make sure that I analyze the global as endogenous to domestic political settlements on the one hand, but on the second, but secondly, to also be very sensitive to how different minerals are embedded in distinct global accumulation patterns, producing differentiated pressures on domestic political settlements. Okay, and then methodologically, this project has been based on my fieldwork experience, which began last year in 2024 in Zambia and South Africa, which involved various types of primary data collection. So before turning to my empirical cases, I want to briefly state the central argument up front. So I'm going to argue that the terrain of developmentalism in both South Africa and Zambia has been significantly reconfigured in the present. I'm going to argue that Zambia has gained new and perhaps historically unprecedented, even if fragile, openings to exert a more muscular form of developmentalism. However, the expression of that agency in the present does not align with the vision of a green developmental regionalism agenda. The South African state, on the other hand, is suffering from an increasingly fragmented and incoherent political economy, where no hegemonic class project exists to anchor an industrialization policy. And this expresses itself in the incoherent and what I would argue are relatively tepid engagements that typify its regional industrialization policy and geopolitical engagements in Zambia in the present. And in short, these comparative political economy dynamics problematize the viability of a green developmental regionalism agenda. Okay, so let me get into the empirical cases. So the new openings for Zambian developmentalism. Okay, so Zambia has experienced the broader revival of resource nationalism among mineral exporting states that I discussed earlier, especially since the previous commodity supercycle. The UPND regime, it came into power promising to return to a more liberal, market-friendly regime in the aftermath of the Patriotic Front's failed resource nationalist attempts. But recent legislative initiatives, I argue, suggest a more durable shift to a more muscular form of resource nationalism, and one that may transcend partisan electoral cycles. And while I acknowledge that the Zambian state remains vulnerable to legacies of domestic predation and external pressure, the new historical conditions, especially how the struggle over access and command over critical mineral value chains, seems to be supportive of this new form of developmental agency. Now, we can see this, I think, in some of the recent policy initiatives engaged by the Zambian regime, beginning in 2023 and culminating in policy changes that occurred as early as last week. And you see here through things like renewed pressure on the state to acquire the discretion for access to interest in new explorations related to critical minerals, and I think more significantly, perhaps the implementation of mandatory local content prescriptions in legislation, bucking the trend of a more liberal and voluntary local content environment of previous legislation. Now, to understand this new assertiveness, I suggest that we must locate it within the historical restructuring of global capitalism. This transition that I mentioned right at the beginning from a neoliberal world order, which in the mining sector expressed itself as the domination of shareholder value calculations in mining, in determining mining investment, towards the logic of the new multipolar and geostrategic tensions of the present. And this would allow us to see, I think, that Zambia's new agency is not merely an outcome of domestic political dynamics, but that the latter have themselves been shaped by developments at the global level. And let me try to make that explicit briefly in what follows. So in the context of liberalization in the 1990s and early 2000s, Western mining firms or mining majors previously hemmed in by the climate of nationalization and interventionism, came under the governance of shareholder value imperatives. And this meant that mining conglomerates like Anglo American, who for the rest of the presentation, you're going to hear a lot about this firm, but it led to firms like Anglo American shedding non-core assets, prioritizing high return operations, adopting short-term investment horizons, and reducing the appetite for politically and operationally complex jurisdictions. African mining assets, Southern African mining assets were significantly devalued in this market environment, and investments became concentrated in South American and Asian jurisdictions. So Zambia undertook the process of liberalization and privatization in this global context, negotiating at a time when Western majors were divesting from these non-core or high-risk mining jurisdictions. And you see this duality of new freedom afforded to mining majors that came with privatization, and at the same time, the discipline which came from financialized interests, from shareholder imperatives, from the City of London, really. This duality of freedom and discipline is well captured, I think, in the acquisition of KCM by Anglo American in 1999, only for the firm to pull out shortly afterwards in 2002 to prioritize expansion of its Chilean operations. This all began to change in the super cycle with the rise of China, which reshaped, I think, the demand and market dynamics on the copper belt in significant ways. Now, obviously, the commodity super cycle was driven by, on the demand side, by the ascent of China into the superpower status it is today. But it was also a period where China, through its going out and later its Belt and Road Initiative, expanded investments throughout the South. And this was part of a broader development and industrialization strategy. So for China, access to copper and other minerals was seen as strategic long before the emergence of today's discourse of critical minerals. And it was this strategic imperative that drove this outward investment of Chinese state-owned enterprises, which slowly acquired Zambian and broader African assets in the context of the 2000s. And these state-owned enterprises, importantly, were governed by a different logic of accumulation, stent-centric logics, not simply shareholder value imperatives. So the presence of these Chinese SOEs, I argue, introduced a hybrid logic of competition on the copper belt, where Western financialized mining capital existed alongside the state-backed geostrategic Chinese competition. And in this way, we can see that the market dynamics on the copper belt in this period began to portend the dynamics of the present multipolar mineral order. Indeed, we can see that the contemporary anxiety among Western states and mining majors regarding China's dominance can be traced to this earlier phase of Chinese outward investment. And with copper now widely considered to be the new oil of the green transition, but also because of its wide use in other strategic industrial applications, Zambia is now able to draw developmental leverage from a global conjuncture or a global transformation that itself helped configure, even if this agency, as I said, remains fragile and uneven. And I think, again, this case study, historical case studies of looking at the conditions that informed that structured Anglo-Americans' acquisitions of KCM in the 1990s, where there was really no serious competition for Anglo-American, given its historical relationships to the copper belt, to the negotiations surrounding Mopani, where not only do you have multiple bidders for this strategic asset, strategic Zambian asset, but they're coming with different logics of accumulation. And I think that this, the fact that Zambia is operating in this competitive multipolar investment environment is giving the state room to exercise agency in ways that were impossible to do in the context of the 1990s liberalization. So briefly, onto the region. So there is this opening for new agency for the Zambian state. But to go back to the question about this green developmental regionalism agenda, is this agency translating into an interest, an opening for the Zambian state to behave in ways that are congenial to this developmental agenda? And if you look at some of the recent policy developments, you would come to the conclusion that no, this is not the case. In fact, Zambia's current actions suggest that it's expressing this new agency in nationalistic and strategic terms. Regional and international alliances engaged by the states are being subsumed into this logic. And recent policies, like, for example, the definition of local content in the Zambia's local content legislation ignores advice from regional continental bodies to promote a regional definition of local content, which would extend the privileges of preferential procurement to the broader regional ecosystem. And you also see with the DRC Battery Value Chain Alliance that was entered into by the Zambian state a few years ago, South Africa was excluded from this agreement. I know that the details around exactly what has transpired with this agreement is unclear, but the point that I want to register is that the regional player with the most significant capabilities to advance battery manufacturing in the region was ignored when the agreement was put together. And that brings us to the question of where is the regional hegemon, the imagined coordinating state in this conjuncture? Now, I'm going to argue that, South Africa is given this potential leadership role by proponents of the green mineral regional agenda, but its actual behavior and engagements with Zambia over the design of its critical minerals industrialization strategies in the present are limited and fall well short of the leadership role envisaged. So what is the South African state actually doing? Now, it's not as if the South African state is sitting idly by, and neither, I would argue, is it behaving in an explicitly predatory way. There are certain agencies within the South African state that are formally endorsing of the idea of a green developmental regionalism agenda and a broader pivot towards green industrialization. We see this, for example, in the presidency, the Department of Trade and Industry, and DIRCO. And we see this just last week in pronouncements from heads of these government units at the recent G20 summit and at the COP. And they are explicitly embracing of this idea that South Africa can lead a green green critical mineral upgrading initiative. But in practice, these initiatives have had limited traction in Zambia thus far. There have been efforts by the South African state to engage with the Zambian counterparts, but this has not produced anything tangible as of yet, at least not to my knowledge. And that raises an important question. Why is this formal commitment and the existence of embodied in institutional and policy frameworks translating into such limited influence? And I'm going to suggest, in now turning to the South African case, that this is effectively answered if we explore how the South African state itself has been exposed to the very same global restructurings that have enabled Zambia's new agency. Okay, so now moving on to the second case. So, since the democratic transition, South Africa, has experienced global restructuring. The South African political economy has been reshaped by this restructuring in more constraining and incoherent ways. The South African economy has experienced the headwinds of financialization, deindustrialization, the erosion of state capacities, which have been exacerbated by fiscal and monetary conservatism and the forces of predation. The mining economy, which was once the fulcrum of the South African economy, has declined in both scale, and its economic linkages with domestic supporting industries have, in some cases, collapsed. South Africa has suffered from declining rates of minerals beneficiation, and you can see I shared a recent news article about anxieties about South Africa's smelters and refineries closing down. And these shifts have all contributed to South Africa's relative decline during this period. And this decline has existed alongside the remarkable ascent of East Asia and China in particular from similar starting points in the 1990s. Now, my core interpretation of the fate of the South Africa's political economy in this area is that it experienced a form of maldevelopment. And by maldevelopment, I mean South African capitalism has lost the economic and political institutional conditions to anchor coherent industrial policy. The historical linkages in the mining industry, manufacturing, and energy nexus, I should say, have eroded. This means that the capitalist class is fractured or has been fractured into competing organized interests tied to divergent circuits of global and domestic accumulation. There is, in short, no hegemonic class project capable of coordinating a national, let alone a regional industrial strategy. I did say I'll be speaking about Anglo-American again, and here it is. So South Africa's mineral political economy, like Zambia's, was uniquely exposed to Anglo-Americans' accommodation of the neoliberal mining regime. And this was given the company's historical dominance over both economies. So the corporation enjoyed nearly 40% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange market share just 1 year before the democratic transition in South Africa in 1994. Anglo was a vertically integrated company that integrated mining, finance, energy, and manufacturing interests in South Africa. And in critical political economy, this fact has been interpreted in different ways. It's been enlisted to support the idea that Anglo-American embodied the classic characteristics of monopoly capital, but in the South African context, or that the firm serves as the fulcrum of a supposed minerals energy complex as a system of accumulation. Yet its historical consolidation related to the shareholder value imperatives that I mentioned earlier, which informed its withdrawal from KCM, severed historical, economic, and political institutional cohesion that it brought to the capitalist class in South Africa. Restructuring involved divestment from South African minerals like coal and gold, and the unbundling of diversified manufacturing interests, part of the explanation for weakened domestic productive capabilities and broader deindustrialization that I mentioned earlier. Now, to understand why South Africa lacks the leverage to anchor a regional green industrialization agenda in Zambia, why, for example, as I said, you have this puzzle between institutional frameworks, policy initiatives, diplomatic efforts to engage Zambia on constructing a collaborative regional critical green minerals agenda. How do we explain that gap? We also need to think or to register how Anglo-Americans' exit from KPM reduced the presence and influence of South African mining capital in the Copperbelt. Anglo-Americans' withdrawal from KCM marked the end of nearly a century of South African corporate leadership in Zambia's copper sector, which extended into the nationalization period, as I mentioned, where the corporation enjoyed effective management control despite nationalization. No South African mining house has played a strategic role in Zambia anywhere near the degree that Anglo-American played in the past. Attempts to return to Zambia by South Africa's mining nationals like Sabanya have been unsuccessful, and they have been outcompeted by bids from new players. Now, this also extends to the distress felt by South African mining, capital equipment, manufacturing, and engineering supplier networks in Zambia, who also have lost out to the benefits of enjoying a compatriot supplier relationship in this segment of the Zambian market. So what you've seen is that, yes, South African suppliers still occupy a dominant position in core, particularly high-value mining manufacturing industries, but this market share has progressively declined and displaced by Eastern and most notably Chinese players. And what's exacerbating this distress is regional infrastructure issues. So while you've seen the commitments to refurbish the Lobito corridor led by Western interests and the Tazara Railway led by Chinese interests, the southern line connecting South Africa's industrial heartland to the Zambian Copperbelt has deteriorated as part of the broader governance failures that I mentioned that has affected the South African political economy in the democratic era. And this decline compromises the competitiveness of South African suppliers and also compromises the ability of Pretoria to leverage regional industrial diplomacy efforts and reduces the scope to advance a regional industrialization agenda. Now, in South Africa, there are also this eroding regional corporate influences also intersecting with domestic dynamics and historical path dependencies. And the elephant in the room here is South Africa's deep reliance on coal as an energy source. So South Africa is indeed, very well endowed with so-called green minerals. But the state pulling wholeheartedly and in one single direction towards a green minerals industrialization policy is constrained by this deep energy path dependency. Even beneficiation of green minerals in South Africa will still require access to a state utilities coal resources, even though there are efforts to onboard renewables. And this carbon coalition enjoys significant institutional power. As I said, it's linked to key South African state-owned enterprises, and this acts as a political blockage to onboarding the green industrialization agenda. Importantly, this is intersecting with, I think, what we can say is the political identity of the ANC regime, which is about Black empowerment. Now, the political capabilities or holding power of this carbon coalition is reinforced by the fact that this agenda has over time become structurally tied to coal and carbon interest. Now, importantly, to keep my global argument intact, this restructuring of a Black empowerment agenda away from structural transformation and away from nationalization towards equity transfers and towards leveraging the state through preferential procurement is a consequence of the transitions engaged by the ANC regime with incumbent political and economic elites in the 1990s. And furthermore, as Anglo shed its unwanted assets in South Africa, its coal assets, it also led to the empowerment of Black-owned firms whose business models are now tied to Eskom's coal fleet. And this means that there is a deep political entanglement between the empowerment agenda and carbon structures. And this leads to the contradictions and limits of South Africa's regional role. So I mentioned a few government departments in South Africa which are keen to embrace a green minerals agenda. This is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. The department responsible for publishing South Africa's critical mineral strategy has explicitly listed coal as a critical mineral. And it promotes a competing regional vision, which prioritizing expanding carbon energy investments in the region to different locales, to locales like Namibia and Mozambique. And the result is that the South African state simultaneously promotes two regional industrial parts, one green and the other embedded in carbon logics with different regional trajectories. And this internal fragmentation, I argue, is fatal to the idea that South Africa can act as a coherent regional development leader, a regional development hegemon, as assumed in the green developmental regionalism vision, despite whatever productive and political institutional capabilities the state's South African economy enjoys over smaller regional partners. So I can say a lot more, but I am sensitive of time, so I'm going to wrap up now with some concluding slides. So Southern Africa is going through a major historical transformation, and this transformation is driven by global restructurings, which are vividly expressed in a new scramble for Southern Africa's critical minerals, and the efforts of regional states to embark on renewed developmentalist programs. My research, a part of which I'm sharing with you today, is at problematizing proposals for a revival of a developmental regionalism idea. And my comparative cases suggest that while the era of neoliberal globalization, an era that ran over the aspirations of the South-South cooperation agenda of the 70s and 80s, while that era is over, the political terrain confronting the agenda remains fraught with difficulty. And finally, I'll conclude an aside for future research. And importantly, what I've stressed here is a dynamic and moving historical process where openings may still be developed that could be harnessed by those seeking to promote this regional green minerals agenda. I do suggest, however, that future works on the prospects for a program should be more seriously grounded in comparative political economy realities, and not aspirational models whose assumptions may be out of sync with the world as it currently is or currently is developing. These research agendas may be strengthened if they embrace the need for a deeper understanding of how geopolitical configurations are shaping Southern Africa's differentiated role in the world economy. It would also be strengthened, I think, if there is a commitment to treat regional peripheries like Zambia as sources of developmentalist initiative and agency and not merely victims of sub-imperial or imperial agendas. I would also say that such generosity should actually be afforded to the South African state, who I feel is negotiating the headwinds of competing interests rather than itself being a victim of external pressure. And there should be a curiosity, I think, to look beyond state actors and towards labor and social movements as potential agents of regional developmental transformation, given the new historical conjuncture. And I'll end there, and I look forward to taking the discussion further. Thank you very much.
Mike, thanks so much. It's a fantastic presentation, really interesting material. We have a lot to work with. So without any delay, let's go to our discussants. Begin with Charles from Mwanza in Lusaka, and then after Charles, we move on to Alex here in Toronto.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so I found both Michael's paper and presentation to be quite insightful. And in my opinion, it does ignite more interest in the political economy of regional industrial upgrade and developmental regionalism, particularly here in Southern Africa. The paper did highlight the role of South Africa as a regional powerhouse and probed its position in the region in a rapidly polarizing world and its engagement with countries experiencing geopolitical competition for critical minerals, such as Zambia. So my reaction will be divided into two parts. The first part will focus on the conceptual issues in the paper and the presentation as well, while the second part will focus mostly on the Zambia-specific issues. So for the first part, I would say the geopolitical competition for access to critical minerals is well framed in the study and the presentation as well. The paper did debunk the norm of an American-led imperialist structure in which China is subservient to the US, as can be maybe argued from the trade war as well as the race for critical minerals, which we are seeing play out here in Southern Africa, as well, where we have seen the European Union, the US, China, as well as other industrialized countries sign several agreements with countries in the region to access critical minerals, Zambia inclusive. The study also, like I mentioned, I highlighted the role of South Africa's position, or it did highlight South Africa's role in the region, even as dynamics change due to the changing world order and the emergence of a multipolar system. Then with regards to Zambia, I would say, just to add on, what I would say is that what we are witnessing in the maybe past 4 to 5 years is a poly-alignment approach to economic diplomacy. Since 2021, we have seen investments coming in from East and West. Investments from China has increased in the mining sector with a few greenfield projects, as well as investments from the West, the US, with the investment in Mingomba mine by Cobalt. Then there is also the issue of the Lobito corridor, which is being supported by the US and EU. Whilst that is happening, we are seeing China trying to revamp the Tazara corridor, which is more of, and you can see that the Zambian government is supportive of both projects, which shows more of a poly-alignment approach to economic diplomacy from the country. Then furthermore, both Eastern and Western firms seem to have increased investment, which I talked about. And then for some of the things that Michael touched on that are Zambia specific, we have seen the government enact two primary mining legislation, the Mineral Regulation Commission Act of 2024 and the Geological and Minerals Development Act of 2025. Initially, the Mineral Regulation Commission Bill had an explicit provision for free carrying interest by the state, which was removed after pressure from the mining industry. But nonetheless, we can see that the state still has the interest to increase its participation in the sector. In that Section 96, the last part of Section 96 of the Act still has a provision for the Minister of Mines to determine the exact state participation in the mining of critical or strategic minerals. In addition, there has also been an increased focus on artisanal and small-scale mining activities, particularly gold mining. And what we see in the Geological and Minerals Development Act is there is a provision to set up an ASM directorate in the Ministry of Mines. And there is also a provision to establish an ASM fund to support the ASM subsector. Yeah, but unexpectedly, the UPND has also, I would mention that what we see with the interest in increasing local participation is unexpected when you consider that when the UPND was in opposition, it was perceived to be more neoliberal or was expected to have a neoliberal stance when it forms government, which is something that Michael did mention. But with the moves that they are making, both at the large scale level and at the ASM level, you are seeing this desire to increase local participation either through the state or through the private sector. However, this desire is still being constrained by Zambia's fiscal position. As some may know here, Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020 during the COVID period. And from the time the UPND came in up to this year, they were not servicing that debt. So during that period, at least maybe they had a bit of room to think about these things. But now you can see debt servicing is coming back on the agenda. Then with regards to regulation of the mining sector, you can see that the same bill, the Mineral Regulation Commission Act, or the same act rather, the same law, the Mineral Regulation Commission Act, establishes a Mineral Regulation Commission to focus on the regulation of the mining sector. However, the success of these reforms will depend on the government's ability to address legacy issues of institutional weaknesses among regulatory authorities, political interference, inadequate financial support, inadequate human resource, both that's quantity and quality, as well as a lack of presence by regulators on the ground. So some of these legacy issues will still constrain the government's ability to reform the sector as well as to attract most to reform the sector. Then on the question of what is critical, so the National Critical Mineral Strategy defines critical minerals as minerals essential for modern technologies, economic and national development. So you can see that Zambia's definition of critical minerals is different from that of industrialized countries. The definition is more aligned to the country's aspiration, even prior to the rest that we are seeing for critical minerals. So it's mostly focused on socio-economic development of the nation. So this definition includes minerals that other countries do not consider as critical minerals, such as gold and gemstones. So Zambia's definition has minerals that others may not consider as critical. And just also to touch on something that Michael mentioned with regards to coal coming back on the agenda, even though it's not listed as among the critical minerals in Zambia, we do see it coming back on the agenda, particularly with the issue of the energy deficit. So Zambia currently is undergoing an energy deficit that has been caused by climatic factors. The frequency and severity of the droughts has increased in recent years. So because of that, Zambia, which is hydro dependent, has found itself in a position where it doesn't have enough electricity to power some of its industries and also provide to the citizens. So because of that, you are seeing an increased investment in alternative sources such as solar, but because of the need for baseload and just the need for power itself, there's also renewed interest or renewed investment in thermal power, particularly core power. Then lastly, just to show that the UPND has particularly we are seeing a shift in its stance from neoliberal to more assertiveness, assertiveness, and just a change in some of its policies. Over the years, we have seen an increase in social protection. That's the number of beneficiaries on Zambia's social cash transfer has increased maybe from roughly around 700,000 in 2020 to over 1.3 million last year, or this year, next year. So maybe to just leave room for Alex and others to come in, I'll end here.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks very much. We'll move on to Alex, and then we'll open up to the floor. And Charles, if you have questions to raise in the round robin session, we will come back to you. Alex.
Sure. I'll keep my comments very brief, Mike. And I'll also say that not only do I comment on your presentation itself, which I thought was very interesting, thank you for that, but also your recent paper in Extractive Industry and Society. So some of my comments might be a combination of both. I think first and foremost, I think I really appreciate your efforts to map out both like a balance of forces in both South Africa and Zambia when analyzing the dynamics of regional critical mineral supply chains. And I think the combination of global production networks and also political settlements in a kind of an interesting regional extrapolation was quite good and interesting. It also, to some degree, is a bit of an Achilles heel, and I'll get to that in a second. But I thought it was really, really interesting and a very well fleshed out methodological and ideological kind of, I guess, support for your overall argument. Obviously, I think I can speak for both Richard and myself that I find your critique of Bond's outdated sub-imperialism argument very refreshing. You really interrogate how the BRICS no longer kind of serve as these deputy sheriffs for American imperialism, especially in the wake of these obvious geopolitical tensions. And this kind of bores itself out around the access control of critical minerals. So I think you provided a very solid rejoinder. And then you've also posited something that maybe people outside the region aren't particularly familiar with around this notion of developmental regionalism, which I thought is very interesting. And I think you get into an excellent analysis around the sort of ideological background and development of the concept in and of itself. But I wonder if you could actually speak to about the technical possibilities of a so-called developmental regionalism, right? For varying reasons, the South African manufacturing sector's share of regional capital goods markets has declined over the past decade or so. In the case of Zambia's copper mining value chain, as you kind of point out in your presentation, but more so in your written work, South African firms have lost their dominance in the mining capital equipment sector, so the upstream side, or they're failing to take advantage of exports for copper processing. For example, the export of metalworking machinery for production of copper semi-fabricates. So then my question to you and anybody else in the Charles included is there a possibility for developmental regionalism and what might it require, right? Obviously, you've done an excellent job of kind of outlining its ideological background and why there is no real possibility in the current conjuncture, in the case of South Africa at least. But if there was, what would it entail, perhaps? It's a bit of a speculative question, but I thought it'd be worth entertaining. Another thing to take into consideration too, I felt, was the focus on South Africa's regional role, but why not look at some of its domestic efforts around critical mineral value chains? I mean, it might go beyond the scope of your own research, might not, but one critical mineral that came to mind is manganese. I mean, South Africa is responsible for about over 30% of global manganese production, yet it's got really limited domestic processing, with only 2% of the mining ore being produced locally being processed. So, it leads one to the question is, how can we expect the South African state and firms to lead, a regional copper value chain if they can't even manage to develop a domestic manganese processing capacity? And I think your argument and why Developmental Regionalism has failed is kind of touches on that, but it might be worth exploring maybe a domestic case study of that particular nature. One thing that may be taken to mind is there are a set of assumptions that accompany leveraging critical minerals for industrialization on both a national and a regional scale, including things like, Innes's staple theory or Hirschman's linkages. And critics, however, not just of yourself, Mike, but of me, of Richard, would counter that such a strategy entrenches extractivist activities or the minerals energy complex in the case of South Africa. To be devil's advocate, does it make more sense to anchor developmental regionalism on another set of industries? If not, why not, right? And then I know I promised Charles that I wouldn't talk about the Zambian stuff, but I could not help myself because I saw an interesting and intriguing point you made during the presentation, right? And that is, Zambia has gained new, historically unprecedented, even if fragile openings to exert a more muscular form of developmentalism. And then Charles obviously pointed to the debt situation, which I think is highly relevant. But there's another point that's worth mentioning. I think that has to do with issues of institutions. And here I'll point to the recent local content statutory instrument, which is barely a month old, and why we should maybe temper our kind of expectations of this kind of newfound or historically unprecedented possibility for developmentalism in Zambia. So right before the 2021 elections, they failed to put forward this local content SI, but the Patriotic Front did put forward something called Statutory Instrument number 35 of 2021, which essentially was a reservation scheme for heavy and bulk commodities by road. Okay, so essentially it was for transporters, which have a very, 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 very heavy influence over the Patriotic Front at the time. And so essentially included among these bulk commodities was copper concentrate, right? The transport of copper concentrate. However, 4 or 5 years later, you still have transport companies, Zambian-owned transport companies, complaining that they don't have access to these contracts, though, despite the fact that this SI had been implemented. And a large part has to do is the issue of implementation and institutional coordination to be able to make sure that people are actually on the ground transporting copper concentrate, and they're given to Zambian nationals to do it. And one difference I'd say about the recent local content measure is it's kind of anchored in a new department. I think it's called now the Large Scale Mining and Mineral Investment Department. And I think a key determinant of whether or not we'll be successful is the fact that it needs this kind of institutional development, which in and of itself draws itself from social tensions and social relations, right? Not to say that they're totally divorced, but I mean, that also, having implemented this kind of political settlements kind of approach in your methodology, one must be wary also of the institutional dynamic, no matter how anchored it is in social relations itself. Okay, thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments and everybody else's.
Mike, would you like to respond before we go and take more questions?
Sure. I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much to both Alex and Charles for your comments. They've really provoked me to think about some of my arguments. And Alex, let me start with you because it's front of mind. So I think let's start with the point about developmental capacity and developmental agencies. I was concerned that that there are blurred lines between what I'm saying here. I'm not necessarily saying, and I suppose this is why I use the word fragile and why I use the word vulnerable. Because the point I'm not in this, at least for this paper or this presentation, I'm not trying to make projections into the future about whether this more muscular efforts to domesticate the value of extraction, right, are going to work. I mean, those are questions. You're right. Those are questions related to Zambia's domestic political settlement and institution and the nature of institutions. I was speaking about I suppose the new openings for the effort, and the fact that the effort is being exercised in ways that are not congenial to the central problem of this particular presentation, which is around the green developmental regionalism agenda. So I take all of your points about this on board. And then you said a couple other really interesting things. I suppose, yes, on the extractivist critique, I suppose that it's going to sound like maybe a little bit of a cop out as saying that, this is the opened up for future research. I mean, I've got a particular problem around this issue and this particular puzzle, and I have not studied what other forms are available. I suppose in my field work, I did encounter activists in labor unions and within communities that are obviously projecting very different visions about what mining's relationship should be to their sense of economic development. I mean, what I would add, though, that in a carbon-intensive economy like South Africa, the extractivist critique, much like the green industrialization critique, falls on politically unreceptive ears to communities and mining workers, which I think needs to be taken into account, I suppose, from the other side. The critics of this minerals-based industrialization agenda. About South Africa's efforts, to beneficiate manganese, there is some sort of beneficiation there, and of course, the high concentration. One thing that I didn't get to speak about was the contrasting interactions that the South African economy has had with China in the same period, and what the South African state is attempting to do is attempting to sort of enlist the type of Chinese foreign direct investment, perhaps, to provide I don't know, the scaffolding for this type of project. But that's besides the more general point, which is the declining productive capabilities in the mining manufacturing ecosystem in South Africa, which is correct. And I think you said those are the technical barriers of the developmental regionalism agenda. I suppose what I was saying was that those technical barriers, the frailties of the South African capital equipment mining manufacturing beneficiation, and also the South African mining industry is part of the same global. The technical situation is part of the change in social relations that I try to sketch out but those points are all well taken. In terms of what might work as an alternative, I'm not sure, but I suppose what I'm saying is that the agents that are imagined in the agenda as it is currently proposed, right, with South Africa playing a leadership role and South African capital acting as the sort of the anchor of the program, that needs to be rethought because we're in a different conjuncture. And then on Charles, thanks, Charles. This issue about coal, I saw this being discussed in Zambia, which I think is really interesting and important to meditate on, because I think that it speaks to, as you said, and as I tried to bring up in my presentation, about how definitions of criticality are mediated by who's using it and in what conditions and with what pressures, right? And it would be interesting to see, given the current energy crisis, whether or not coal does become on the agenda. And then I suppose that does open alternative regional pathways. If indeed the South African state is looking for people, well, at least a section of the South African state is looking for receptive, let's say, regional partners for expanding the coal energy mix, then I suppose that could be a space to watch. And again, yes, I really do take on board again what you mentioned about the fragility of the developmentalist efforts, and particularly the fiscal crisis, the drought, and negotiations, with with the debt, the debt overhang, which constrains the possibilities of success. And I think, yes, it's important that I think you mentioned this issue about social spending, which I didn't raise, which also seems to, I suppose, strengthen, what I've been trying to argue, that this the shift to a more developmentalist or more interventionist state, both in terms of industrial policy and now, as you mentioned, in terms of social policy, is one that might endure beyond electoral changes, despite the ideological rhetoric of whichever regime is in power. So yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for your comments. I look forward to discussing things further when we get to meet in person again. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for those excellent first questions. Let's now go to our audience. We have Naim Sheikh, whose hand has been up for a while online. To invite others to put their hands up online if they'd like to speak, and then we'll go around the table here as well at York. So if I could ask Naim Sheikh to begin, please.
Oh, hi. Hello, how are you? Michael, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. As they say that the devil is in the details, and you have pretty much covered all the details thoroughly. My 2 cents worth or suggestion is that, I don't know, you may have done it in your introduction. Have you thought about embedding your research into the classical developmental state studies like Chalmers Johnson's in this developmental school? The 2 arguments which comes into my mind are, comparatively speaking, analytically, through the analytical lens, is a structural institutional perspective, and the other one is the political economy or geoeconomic perspective. If you have a minute, I can elaborate a little bit on these 2 arguments. All right. Argument number 1, which I'm suggesting, is a structural institutional perspective. East Asian success rested on deep state capacity, institutional discipline, and policy coherence, whereas Southern African green industrialization, as you pointed out, operates in a more fragmented, institutionally constrained environment. I won't go into detail because you have already covered most of it. The other one, the political economy or geoeconomic perspective, argument would state that while East Asian leveraged post-Cold War or Cold War geopolitical subsidies, whereas Southern Africa faces a global environment where structural constraints are harsher, capital is more mobile, and global value chains are dominated by powerful incumbents. That's my suggestion, and thank you very much.
All right, can call on you, please, from Lusaka. If you could unmute yourself, Maya, please.
Right, I didn't hear you. Yeah, thanks, Michael, for a really interesting presentation, and I hope you can share the PowerPoint, because it went beyond the paper, and it's really, you bring really interesting elements together. I thought there's a little bit of shift going on within the region, and it's also quite recent. So when UPND came into power, it was not one of course, not one of the liberation parties. I mean, neither was PF or one of the earlier ones, but also it meant it was more than that. That UPND was allied to the DA in South Africa, to the MDC in Zimbabwe, and all of that. So it was kind of an outlier when it came into power. And now, in more recent times, you can see a little bit more of an engagement. With HH visiting Zimbabwe and trying to do some cooperation in terms of energy and infrastructure and all of that. So I'm wondering, if there's a changing relationship going on, which potentially might extend to South Africa and the region. The other thing I thought would be important to look at is, besides the corridors to the east and the west, would be the corridor to Namibia, because that's really where the big investment is going and is actually happening now, and try to understand the significance of that. So that those are my points. Thank you.
Take another few questions so we can deal with them at once from around the table. Nothing. I have a question. We've had a lot of cases in the last 30 years in Southern Africa of various attempts at regionalism, forms of free trade, cross-border investment, FDI. South Africa changed its regulations for the export of capital in the 1990s to make that a conducive environment. We've seen the SADC free trade area and negotiations around that in order to have a shared, all boats floating approach to trade and investment in terms of labor protocols as well. Number of initiatives in that regard. We've seen as well on the industrial level an initiative 20 years ago, 25 years ago, to develop SADC industrial corridors in various parts of the region, including South Africa, very much led by the South African DTI, Trade and Industry. And the one thing they have in common for the most part is that they've been spectacular failures. They haven't taken off. Partly from lack of investment, partly as well, more importantly, is a lack of enduring collaboration amongst governments in the region with very diverse interests, with domestic political constituencies that have to come first, especially in a period of greater democratization, and an antagonism, or at least a reticence or wariness of the role of hegemon, and that being South Africa in the region. The imbalances, in other words, and the likely winners from that kind of regional cooperation, opening up of the regional space. And many saw it as the opening up or expanding of the South African domestic market into the region of 200 million people. If that's been the case, there's been, economic obstacles and wariness and anxieties around that kind of opened up cooperation, even within just the realm of SADC. If that's been the case among governments, especially worried about their political legitimacy, have there been other sources of a developmentalist or regional developmental approach? We've seen, for example, at the level of SADC, an organization, a regular platform for trade unions to engage around common issues of work and access and redistribution of benefits. This also happens amongst mining trade unions in the region. We've seen regional discussions, collaborations amongst various representatives of ASM, artisanal small-scale mining, for greater inclusion, how that might be clarified at the level of SADC. And as well as other things related to mining and minerals and environmental regulations, environmental discussions about what a regional code would look like, regional investment code and best practices, ethical codes for mining investment, and of course, tax justice networks around illicit financial transfers from the mining sector especially. So there are all these different kind of socially based or civil society based initiatives directly linked, organically linked into the mining sector in the different countries of the region. Have you seen anything in your work in South Africa, from a South African perspective, or from engaging with Zambians around alternatives emerging from outside of the state in terms of linking up a common program or a shared vision of what a more equitable, evenly balanced form of strategic green transition, if you want, would look like in the region? And if there is that, who's leading it? What are they saying?
That's quite a few questions, and Mike, maybe you want to take those.
Yeah, let's begin with those.
Thanks everyone for the questions. I'll start with Richard, the last question. So yes, I did engage with community mining affected communities and trade unions and various types of social movements proximate to this discussion about green transition and mining. A couple of things is that I suppose, much like the existence of formal institutions that you mapped out in SADC, the existence of protocols, the existence of bodies that convene at the interministerial level or the bureaucratic level, those do exist, I suppose, but then again, they suffer from the same type of sort of practical inertia, lack of sustained action around a common program. And I think it relates to sort of what I was saying to Alex earlier, that the especially in South Africa, as I mentioned, the conflicts between communities embedded in the coal energy mix and coal miners and unions, the engaging with unions in the auto industry, for example, are alert to the potentials to grow a battery to electric vehicle value chain in South Africa. But that division, that sectoral division, plays out in terms of the types of political cohesion that can be established within labor and between labor and social movements and affected communities. So that is a real tension, and that bubbles up, particularly in events that I attended on fieldwork. That sometimes overspills in quite dramatic ways. So there is a live political contestation around this issue. In terms of putting the question about alternative regional development arena, I suppose most of people I engage with, this was not proximate to the conversation. The proximate issue was thinking externally. So thinking about the scramble for Africa's critical mineral resources from the traditional sort of old colonial powers, Western powers, and the new arrival of Chinese actors. And I think that for a lot of people in social movements and in labor, there is still let's say, a debate about how to make sense of these dynamics, whether or not they are expressive of sub-imperial dynamics or not. Whether there is, for example, I'm not sure if all sort of agree with my qualitative distinction between Chinese capital and the Chinese state. And these are, I suppose, discussions that are alive in the broader labor movement, labor now being sort of broadly defined. In terms of, the efforts, the failed efforts of, let's say, programs driven by the elites, I think, you mentioned, I think, the MDC. This was a sort of, in my understanding, was a presidency-driven initiative. And once the presidents changed hands, this relationship sort of petered out, or at least the vision of a collaborative regional infrastructural project was not, obviously, did not bear fruit. But then again, I would also say that the existence of the MDC and the existence of these spatial corridors were also efforts from within the South African state to contest the broad open regionalism, liberalized approach of SADC as such, which was emphasizing, the way you achieve collective upliftment is by eradicating barriers to trade. It's simple. And then the market forces will allocate the resources efficiently, such that you don't have to take on the burden of these types of interventionist policies. I think I'll leave that from your side, Richard, and move on to the other comments. Maria, thanks for your comments. It's good to be interacting again. I think I mentioned the issue of presidential cohesion with the MDC, and I do think that this has played some role. in terms of tensions, perhaps, or awkwardness, maybe is a better way to describe it, between the ANC regime and the new regime in Zambia. There is a sense in which these parties or these states are operating in different historical times in a way. So I mentioned the decolonization agenda of the ANC around Black economic empowerment. The ANC very much still conceives of itself as a liberation movement, still conceives of itself in terms of the revolutionary role, I suppose, assigned to it by the developmental regionalism idea, and I suppose interacts in awkward ways with political parties that have emerged further down the lines of a decolonization process in the region. I mean, what I would say is that I do think that there is a concerted effort now within the South African diplomatic cluster to professionalize the economic diplomacy engagements a bit more. And as I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of that has to do with the need for South Africa, or perceived need for South Africa, to play a more significant role in negotiating critical minerals value chains, to not sort of miss the boat. And I think, yes, the Walvis Bay, I think in Namibia, yes, that's another. EU in particular opens up issues about green hydrogen, and a conversation that I did not get into, which is another conversation to have about South African political economy, energy issues. But yes, that is something that I did miss out, and I need to think more thoroughly about. And then the first comments and questions from Naim Sheikh. Yes, I'm not sure when you joined the conversation, but I suppose that what you are suggesting here is exactly where I'm trying to anchor these interventions in terms of the literature, providing I suppose, a political economy response to the developmental state literature, which is how I read, the origins of the political settlements approach, building on other criticisms of the original articulations or explanations of that experience of developmentalism in East Asia that's sensitive to processes, of class formation, institutional political realities. And then geopolitical, change. I suppose what I'm trying to do in this is to really foreground, understand the changing global dynamics and segment it very carefully into geostrategic perspective, commercial realities, and then to locate it within particular commodity value chains, to understand that the competitive dynamics from coal are different to manganese, are different to copper, different to lithium. And those competitive dynamics have important shaping roles, developmentalist terrains. So yeah, I would say I'm with you in a way. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. We've got two more questions, one from the table here that you've seen, and one online. We'll start with you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting for us. We're members of Professor Saunders' Developmental State Seminar. We're learning much from your presentation. I guess drawing on, some of the concepts that we've dealt with in this course, or one of the concepts, I guess my question was, we reviewed this sort of work by Gabor and Silla on this notion of, I'm not asking you to jump too much into the green hydrogen or another country case, but this idea of de-risking developmentalist paradigm. I guess that broadly, paints a picture of trying to incentivize private investment in the sort of developmentalist paradigm in which the private sector, particularly foreign private sector, is sort of in the driver's seat, quote unquote. I was just wondering if you could broadly compare and contrast the sort of, as you termed it, more muscular developmentalist dynamic underway in Zambia with this de-risking developmentalist sort of concept.
And if I can go to Chris Stevens to ask another question and take them both together.
Yeah, hi Mike. Thanks a lot for the talk. One thing I was just wondering a little bit about, because we talking about this idea of regionalism, awkwardness between parties and between the states and leaders, and how that can also come from these, different communities surrounding, or sorry, different commitments surrounding local constituencies that may be impacted by regionalism. I was wondering if you have put much thought or focus on the kind of electoral concerns in both Zambia and South Africa surrounding this, seeing as, in the past, 4, 10 years in both countries, elections have become much more competitive, have become a huge source of contention between various social groups, and, especially within this political settlements approach, how are these kind of electoral concerns of governments that, have a vested interest in staying in power, forcing them to focus, more nationally and internally on satisfying these local social groupings versus focusing on kind of building some kind of regional grouping or regional ideas around green investment. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
Mike, would you like to address those two? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for the questions again. On the start with de-risking. So yes, I'm aware of this literature. I suppose I haven't really sort of made up my mind about it completely. And obviously, I think that this, the critique is well taken that this de-risking agenda sort of, socializes the risk of energy-related investments and so on. But I mean, maybe just an interesting remark or an interest to share with you an interesting line of thinking that I've been engaging with myself is that, the mining industry itself is calling for a type of de-risking. So mining majors are calling for a type of de-risking for more exploration because, being subject to the dictates of financialized or shareholder logic means that these Western mining majors have fallen behind state-backed Chinese investments in industries like copper. And there's an interview which I encourage people to watch with Paul Gates. He's the head of group strategy at Anglo American, speaking about this precise issue. And maybe I'm completely reading this wrong, but he's interpreting what has happened as with the ascent of China as a type of de-risking initiative engaged by the Chinese state over a long period of time. So I think I don't know if that satisfies your question, other than to say that my mind is not completely made up, and I think that the question of the state's role in financing in investments and the type of modalities around that is interesting. Not just the state, but also productive enterprises and industry. The tensioned relationship between financial markets and manufacturing or mining interests. And then Chris, on electoral concerns, yes, I mean I would say that this is one of the foundational issues around energy, and in South African case, this is about another driver of the holding power of the carbon coalition in South Africa. The state's legitimacy is fundamentally tied to keeping the lights on. It's not just about electoral legitimacy, like regime, the reproduction of regime type. It's fundamentally about the sustainability of the state. You cannot have a situation in which you risk power going off. I mean, that will have significant and has had significant electoral consequences in South Africa for the ANC regime. And this matters a great deal. And then I suppose that filters into my arguments concerning the contradictory relational projections of the ANC state into the region. and is related to Charles's comments earlier about the Zambian energy crisis and speculations around coal.
Any questions going around the table? From online? I see a hand up, but I'm not sure where it's from.
Charles.
It's Charles. Charles?
Yeah. So, yeah, the hand was from me. Yeah, just maybe a question and a comment. So the question is maybe looking at some of these regional initiatives that we are seeing, for instance, the EV battery special economic zone that's being set up between Zambia and the DRC. But DRC, what we see in most of these initiatives is the lack of the presence of SADC. Because when you look at both the EV battery initiative as well as the agro processing between Zambia and Zimbabwe, both are being supported by UNECA and some of the other regional multilateral organizations or multilateral bodies. So if SADC was to get involved, what could be its role? And then the other question is, how can it ensure collaboration instead of competition? Because when you look at some of the countries in the region, they have similar strengths and weaknesses. Most of them, their strengths lies in their minerals, and then their weaknesses, structural weaknesses, and the others. So how can SADC come in, and how can it ensure that there is collaboration instead of competition? Then maybe I remember that Alex had raised the question on should be value addition in Zambia and the aspect of metal fabrication, if I recall correctly. Alex?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. So, yeah. So I think what I can say with regards to that, where I think there might be room is refining, because when you look at it, even just when you talk refining as well as metal fabrication, which are the midstream kind of activities, though with metal fabrication, there are still some issues that have to be addressed. And some of these legacy issues are like access to copper, which is a big issue for some of the metal fabricators and wire and cable manufacturers in Zambia. But again, over the years, what we have seen in this space and why I'm a bit optimistic about them is that there has been increased investment in them. The number of players has increased, as well as there has been export into the region as well as into East Africa. So there's a bit of optimism there. But with refining, it's mostly because the copper is there. Copper concentrate is there. So if they can address some of the issues that have to do, some of the infrastructure issues, and particularly the energy issue, because refining is more energy intensive. So yeah, there could be room there if some of the infrastructure issues are addressed.
Thanks, Charles.
Before Mike responded, I just wanted to make one comment about copper fabrication. I think the point I was making with respect to South Africa's inability to capitalize on the ability to export, metalworking machinery, right? Essentially, it has the capital goods sector. It can export if it wanted to, but it's just failing to do so for a variety of reasons, which have been covered by authors other than myself. With respect to the potential for copper fabrication in Zambia, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate Charles's optimism. I'm a little bit skeptical, only because of economies of scale in the region around the desire and need for semi-fabricates, right? So I don't know. Maybe there's a possibility, maybe there isn't, but TBD, I guess. We'll see in the next 5 years. Mike, sorry, go ahead and respond.
I'll go along with you, TBD on that one, Alex, and just speak about the SADC arrangement. So I don't want to propose grandiose ideas here, and that the SADC does have a mining protocol, and it does have it does have an existing institutional infrastructure. The point is that it is not well supported by member states, for reasons I think part of the reasons that Richard previously discussed. I mean, one of the low-hanging fruits that SADC could do is just generate internal planning capacity. I mean, what is clear is that, the mining secretariat in SADC doesn't have internal knowledge capabilities. They outsource this to consultants, and in my view, the consultants are not. I mean, the incentives are not aligned to the problems that we've all been discussing, to addressing the problems that we've all been discussing in today's conversation. And that might be a small and incremental step towards a more proactive a role for SADC, which is not perhaps fiscally a significant contribution from regional states, and is relatively politically neutral to overcome some of the barriers that we've mentioned. Yeah, and I think that's all I want to say about that.
Just one more question from me, Mike. Do you see any sign in places like Zambia of other forms of South-South cooperation? We've seen, for example, an MOU between Indonesia and DRC around cobalt, the world's #1 and 2 cobalt producer. Do you see or hear of any similar kind of potential collaboration or exploratory discussions, say, for example, with the Chileans, world's #1 producer copper, Peruvians, Zambians, or is there any of that kind of discussion going on about alternative forms of South-South cooperation, what it might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I can only refer to sort of anecdotal evidence, but Morocco has been involved in conversations, I understand, and I think Chile too, in the battery chain, the battery alliance. But I think that it's important to recognize that there are other southern players with interests in the region. Brazil, maybe not in Zambia, but is India. I mean, one thing that I didn't mention is that South Africa's major export for coal is India, and so yeah, again, that carbon coalition is linked with the southern trading partner and so on. So that's an interesting line of thinking that needs to be engaged. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from here or online?
I've got one comment.
One comment.
I think it's convenient and interesting to look at Anglo as a kind of case study of a South African mining major that kind of, made a brief foray back into the Zambian space and then pulled out in 2020 or 2002. But there's another instance of a South African company pulling out more recently, which is in around Lubambe, right? And it's interesting because it involved Patrice Motsepe's African Rainbow Minerals, right?
Yeah.
And I think, Mike, even for your own dissertation, it might be interesting to study that case as well, and some of the intricacies around that, only because it was cobalt metals that later in around Chilebombe found the Mingomba deposit. Well, they didn't find the Mingomba deposit, but anyways, they rediscovered it, let's say. And as the potential was there, conceivably, for a large mineral exploration project and eventual production, one can imagine. But it for a variety of different reasons, it also kind of just folded. And what's most interesting about that is it wasn't just the South Africans involved, right? Motsepe's outfit didn't have the capacity to mine copper. They had to partner with Vale, the Brazilians, right? Which adds interesting and dynamic, especially around this notion of the BRICS. So it might be worthwhile, if for your own dissertation, that also maybe take consideration that one, that one experiment as well. I mean, the KCM and Anglo is kind of classical, right? I mean, but this other less observed and less examined case might be worthwhile exploring as well. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, Alex. Okay, do you quick follow-up? Was this sale to a Chinese firm?
It was to EMR Capital, which was Australian listed but Hong Kong based, and then eventually went to JCHX, which is Chinese. Yeah, eventually.
Equinox.
It wasn't Equinox Minerals. It was it was EMR Capital. It was an Australian-based or Australian-listed company, but in fact, they were themselves also Chinese, from what I understand. I mean, Maya or Charles can verify that. But yeah, the Lubambe case is an interesting one as well, especially because of its interesting dynamics and its involvement of the Brazilians and that kind of space there, and a prominent kind of BEE recipient, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our questions. We've also come very close to the end of our time. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Mike. That was a really provocative, really interesting presentation. Looking forward to seeing more of that material in depth in your work. Thank you. And thank you to Charles and both of you for being up late. I know it's late into the evening in Southern Africa. And our other guests who are from Southern Africa, thanks for staying up to participate. Thanks very much. And thanks as well to Alex here in Toronto. It was a really great discussion, great material, and looking forward to reading more of this. Thanks very much to everyone. And thanks for our crowd here.
Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the comments and feedback. Really helpful.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Charles.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Mike.
Bye.
Good night.